Ragnar Lothbrok, The Tale of a Viking Warrior King. Written by Bernard Hayes. Narrated by J. Huff. Chapter 1. Fact or Fiction? Ragnar Lothbrok, or Ragnar Lothbrok, as his name is often referred by, was the true definition of legendary. This Viking warrior was a distinguished hero and leader of the people of the North, and is the subject of poems and sagas during the Viking era. Per traditional Norse literature that has been uncovered, Ragnar was famous for his numerous raids in what is now the countries of modern France and England during the 9th century. As the legend of Viking culture, whose life only moderately took place in periods and locales discussed and written about in ancient texts, the extent of Ragnar's historic actuality is not clear and tends to be obscure. While it was long held that Ragnar Lothbrok was a fictional hero because of the sagas that were written about him and his adventures, it is now ascertained by many historians and scholars that much of what was written about this fearless warrior is based somewhere between historical recounts of actual events and some literary imagination. Wherever the truth lies, somewhere in between myth and fact, the illustrious accomplishments of this great Viking warrior and king cannot be overlooked. The Ragnar surrounding the tales and sagas is based on an actual man who lived during the age, but historians argue on exactly who that man was. Some even contemplate that the stories surrounding the legendary Viking warrior may be based on more than one man. Historians claim there is more than one contender who may, in fact, be the real Ragnar, or men who are based on the myths surrounding him and his legendary deeds. One of these perceived candidates is King Horik I. King Horik I was the king of the Danes from 827 AD until his death in 854 AD. His reign was marked by raids on the Franco-German Empire of Louis the Pious by the Danish. King Regenfrid and his brothers were overthrown by the sons of another previous king in Denmark, King Gudfred. Roenvald, who was also known as Ragnall, is another candidate that is debated. Ragnall was the leader of a tribe of Norsemen who managed to conquer Northumbria around the 10th century. There is, without question, a close timeline when considering Ragnar and Ragnall. Ragnar's death is believed to have occurred around 865 AD. This would indicate that Ragnar was born around 820 AD. Ragnar Lothbrok is undeniably identified to have been a fabled chieftain of the Norsemen throughout the Viking Age. Another candidate historians often consider to coincide with the legendary Ragnar is Reginhirus, a Viking warrior who was documented as being employed by King Horik I. Reginhirus attacked Paris during the 9th century. The fierce warrior Reginhirus hanged 111 Christians during his siege of Paris, and in accounts, it is noted that Reginhirus died shortly after the attack of an illness. Many believe that this Reginhirus and Ragnar were, in fact, one and the same, but the varying accounts also pose questions as to the name Lothbrok or Lothbrok as well. Ragnar, or whatever his name and identity truly were, did not get his moniker until after he died. Lothbrok or Lothbrok first appeared in 2 accounts. One account that hails from France and another from Iceland in around 1120 AD. There are several interpretations and possible explanations as to what the nickname means. An English author around 1150 AD stated that Lothbrok meant loathsome brook. But according to the Old Norse tongue, Lothbrok would have been translated as hairy breeches or shaggy trousers. The Icelandic author who penned Ragnar's saga in the 13th century stated that Ragnar won his moniker because of the pants he wore to protect himself during a notorious battle with a poison-breathing dragon that won him not only glory and fame, but the hand of one of his wives. These pants were purposely rolled in sand and boiled in pitch to protect him. Another, albeit unflattering theory, is that shaggy trousers is an inaccurate translation, and that the alternative is a reference to the alternate theory of how Ragnar may have died. According to some, Ragnar actually died after his raid on Paris, and that he contracted dysentery, which caused his eventual demise. One account even makes a reference to his innards spilling out of his body. If this is factual, then his pants would have appeared to have been dipped in tar and pitch because they would have been stained with diarrhea. As unhonorable death this may seem, it could well be that the actual reasons behind the reference to his breeches were one of feces-stained trousers. For the purpose of this book, we will pretend that Ragnar, the fierce, ferocious Viking king warrior, did not get his nickname from the latter. It is just too un-Viking for such a legendary man. Per the most prevalent version of Ragnar's legendary existence, he is notorious for being the blight of both early medieval England and France. Ragnar was accredited for raiding the Northumbria and Wessex, as well as the kingdom of West Francia. Viking raids were nothing new, as Vikings had been raiding Scotland and England since the late 700 AD period. It does seem that Ragnar may have been the first Viking warrior to attempt to settle, colonize, and control lands on foreign soil, as opposed to the typical pillaging and plundering that had occurred in previous years. Viking conquerors have been landing on French soil and raiding since 800 AD as well. In 845 AD, the warrior Ragnar sailed south with a huge fleet that included around 5,000 warriors and about 120 ships in his command. He ravaged and pillaged the Frankish Empire, and this story of Ragnar is so similar when compared with the tales of Ragnar that in all likelihood, the two Viking warriors were one and the same. During this period, Rouen was also raided. Rouen was the capital city of Normandy, and from 911 AD, it was controlled by Vikings who had pledged allegiance to France. So the Norse who subjugated England in 1066 were most likely Viking in origin, ironically enough. In 845 AD, the Norse also laid siege to Paris, and during this siege, the Viking warriors overwhelmed the army of King Charles the Bald. The Norsemen only agreed to leave once they had been paid 7,000 pounds of silver. This was an astronomical amount of money for the era. Stories and historic versions in the feudal literature regarding Ragnar Lothbrok diverge at times. However, the indispensable accounts of Ragnar are that he was, in fact, a Norse chieftain who raided and invaded England and France, and these specific facts are almost identical in every account that referenced the legend. Ragnar was possibly a powerful lord or jarl during the reign of King Horik II of Denmark. Despite varying popular accounts today, it is more probable that Ragnar heralded from Sweden or Denmark, rather than the commonly depicted Norway. French historians attest that Ragnar was not only a fierce and powerful warrior, but also a Danish king, who was the speculated son of Danish king Sigurd Herring and the daughter of King Alf, who ruled over Alfheimr, whose name was Alfhild. If this is true, Ragnar was born of royal blood on both his parents' sides. It is said that Alfhild died after giving birth to Ragnar. Also, it is important to note that many have previously depicted Ragnar as an impoverished farmer who only rose to great power as a result of his conquests and many raids. On the contrary, if his royal lineage is accurate, it would indicate that those who say Ragnar was a born noble and rose to also become a successful and powerful warrior are more accurate. It is mentioned in the ancient sagas of the Norse that Ragnar's father, Sigurd, had Ragnar recognized during an assembly of the Althing as next in line to reign before he set out on his last expedition, when Ragnar was only 15 years old. While we will never know with full accuracy whether the Nordic sagas are in reference to one man or tales spun from myth to create a legendary heroism that Ragnar Lothbrok is associated with, it is almost certain that the written tales are at the very least based on deeds of ancient Norse rulers and warriors during the Viking Age. Norse folklore played an often important role in the fostering of some of the legendary accounts, and probably the histories and sagas about Ragnar Lothbrok are indeed part factual and part fictional. The question remains as to who was the real Viking warrior and possible king known as Ragnar. Despite the varying accounts and uncertain beginnings, it is also affirmed that Ragnar was not a simple-minded brute whose only goal was to loot and pillage foreign lands. Most accounts describe a man who, yes, was fearsome and violent in battle, but also a man who was good to those under his leadership and protection. A man with big aspirations and an eye for the future, and one who will continue to go down as inventive and of superior intelligence. It must be kept in mind that battle patterns and concentrated attacks were a new concept, and it is felt by many that Ragnar's actions brought about the modernization of the art of war, whether it be by his actions or actions the opposing forces were made to take due to his different attack methods and techniques. As speculative as to the true identity of who Ragnar was, there is as much speculation as to how many wives he had and how many children they bore him. Most historical accounts point to Ragnar being wed 3 times, although there are some ancient texts that would indicate a 4th wife as well. The first documented wife was Lagertha, a fierce shield maiden in her own right. The second wife mentioned was Thora Townheart, who was said to be the daughter of an earl, and the third wife was a princess or queen named Asaug. The 4th wife, contributed to the legend that is the life of Ragnar, so far has gone unnamed. And this mention of a 4th wife offers little to no information as to who her identity may have been, or if she bore Ragnar any children. While little is provable, the idea of 3 or 4 wives during the Viking Age is no stretch of the imagination, as it was custom for men of this time to have more than one wife, even simultaneously. What is ironic about the concept of polygamy during this period is that adultery committed by a woman could warrant her sale into slavery, and men could actually be sentenced to death for the crime. One has to assume that the pressure of keeping multiple wives happy to prevent an accusation of adultery must have been a stressful and delicate balance, and one had to be wealthy in order to economically be able to provide for all wives and children. Again, if Ragnar was a noble or born of royal blood, he could have had multiple wives, and simultaneously at that. Whether he was married 3 or 4 times is speculative, but the number of children said to be fathered by Ragnar is impressive nonetheless. Ragnar was believed to have 2 daughters with Lagertha, the Shield Maiden, and it is referenced in passing that he did in fact have several other daughters with his other wives, but there is no clear number, and so far the only 2 names mentioned in ancient texts are Ragnhild and Alf Ragnar's daughter. His sons, however, are better documented. Ubba, Hvitserk, Halfdan, Halfda, Eric, Agnar, Hastine, Rognvald, Harald, Friedleif, and Ivar the Boneless, and the well-known Bjorn Ironside are all documented as being born of Ragnar. Both Ivan and Bjorn are mentioned in many Norse sagas, and are in their own right legendary Viking heroes. During the ancient Viking era, it was common for prolific kinds of warriors to adopt other children as a way of ensuring their dynasty and legacy stayed intact, because the biological parents were deceased, or even to ensure that who they wanted to succeed upon their death did so. Because this practice did occur, it is fair to wonder if all the children claimed to be Ragnar's were his biologically or by design. Another factor to consider are the children that may be undocumented, as a Viking man could impregnate their slaves at any time, and if they chose to admit to their parentage, those children, despite being born of a slave for a mother, would be seen as legitimate children of their father and treated as such. Only if a child was born of 2 slaves for parents would that offspring be automatically classed as slave as well. At any rate, it is well documented that the sons of Ragnar were successful and warrior legends, and there are even sagas written to honor them also. Ragnar's sons were renowned as powerful and fierce chieftains of the Norse, who led a coalition of Norse warriors who hailed from Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, known as the Great Heathen Army. This heathen army was said to be commanded by Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Ragnar's son, Ubba, Bjorn Ironside, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye. In 865 AD, the Great Heathen Army, led by Ragnar's sons, landed in England and began a 14-year-long war against the Saxon kingdom. This war ended in 878 AD, when the king of East Anglia gave the Viking warriors horses and a territory, which was named Danelaw, in exchange for a truce of sorts, encouraging the army to attack other kingdoms and giving their kingdom a respite from the incessant attacks. Many speculate that the reasons behind the brothers' unrelenting attacks on the medieval Britain were largely due to the death of their father. While there are 2 accounts of exactly how Ragnar died, all known accounts agree that Ragnar died on English soil. Per one tale, Ragnar was captured by King Aelle of Northumbria. King Aelle is said to have sentenced Ragnar to death, ordering him to be thrown into a pit full of poisonous snakes. This account describes an illness similar to dysentery, and that Ragnar died because of his illness before making it home to his native land. We may never be able to specifically separate truth from myth. The sagas, poems, and stories of Ragnar and his family, but this no doubt shows that whomever Ragnar really was, he and his iconic image have gone down in history as one of the most accomplished and celebrated Vikings in all of Norse mythology and lore. Chapter 2: Ragnar's 3 Wives. There are many stories of Ragnar and his deeds within the sagas that were written about him, and this chapter is dedicated to the recollection of the tales revolving around Ragnar and his wives. Whether they are factual or fictional, these are the stories and poems of Ragnar and his 3 wives that have been handed down through the ages. Ragnar and Lagerthea. The story of how Ragnar met his first wife, Lagerthea, is an interesting one, as it ends in divorce, and in ancient times, divorce was not commonly documented. The tale begins when Ragnar takes to battle to avenge the death of King Sigurd of Norway. King Fro of Sweden led his men to Norway and killed King Sigurd. To further humiliate the deceased king and his legacy, King Fro decreed that the women on King Sigurd's family be sent to work in a brothel. Ragnar heard of this, and while he was always fierce in battle, the idea of the former king of Norway's family being sent to a brothel upset his senses. And so Ragnar gathered his men and went to Norway to avenge King Sigurd's death and rescue his family. The story is told that during the battle at the brothel, a few of the bravest women took up arms to fight alongside Ragnar and his men, and the shield maiden Lagerthea was one of those fierce women. Ragnar was so impressed with Lagerthea that once the battle was won, he followed Lagerthea back to her court to pursue her hand in marriage. Lagerthea was not interested in marriage, but she chose to string Ragnar along until the day came when he appeared to propose. Lagerthea was protected by a bear and a large hound, and when Ragnar arrived, both animals attacked Ragnar immediately. Ragnar killed the dog with his hands and used his spear to overcome the bear, and in doing so, won Lagerthea's hand in marriage. The 2 were wed, but Ragnar still held a grudge over Lagerthea's beasts attacking him, and he saw this as his wife's direct attempt to prevent his arrival and thwart their nuptials. It is believed that after the birth of their son, Fridleif, and their 2 girls, Ragnar divorced Lagerthea and returned to Denmark. After Ragnar had been back home in Denmark for a certain amount of time, civil war broke out amongst the Danish tribes. Ragnar sent word for help, and it is told that Lagerthea sent 120 warships full of men to aid him and rode along to ensure all ended well and in Ragnar's favor. With Lagerthea's help, the civil war went Ragnar's way, and for this he was grateful. Making certain Ragnar's place in Denmark was secure, it is said that Lagerthea returned to her home in Norway, where she eventually ran into some trouble of her own by way of her second husband. Lagerthea and her new spouse fought constantly according to some accounts, and because of this constant volatile relationship, one night Lagerthea killed him, tired of sharing rule with a man. Lagerthea then ensured her own sovereignty and ruled alone from then on. Some historians believe that Lagerthea was not, in fact, a real Viking woman, but a reference to Lathgertha. Lathgertha is often considered an alternate name for Thorgerd. Thorgerd was a goddess and was considered to be a guardian of sorts, and she may also be connected with the goddess Freya. Whether Lagerthea was a shield maiden or a mythological reference to one of the goddesses, scholars may never uncover. Ragnar kills a serpent and gains a wife. King Sigurd Hering ruled over Denmark and had become a legend due in large part because of the battle he had won against Harald Wartooth in Bravelir. King Hering had one son, whose name was Ragnar. Ragnar was a healthy lad and had grown to be rather large, and also a very good-looking Viking. Ragnar was very intelligent and was good to all the men in his command, but also known as being ferocious toward all enemies. As soon as Ragnar came of age, he gathered as many men as he could, acquired his own Viking ship, and sailed around the world, becoming known as the greatest Viking warrior of the age. As it was told, Ragnar was so brave and successful in his conquests that none were his equal in battle. During this period in Ragnar's life, a powerful jarl named Herod, who lived in Gautland, also reigned in his region. Jarl Herod had a gorgeous daughter named Thora, and she was beloved by her father and all those that knew her. Thora was nicknamed Fortress Heart, which was a testimony to her beauty, manners, and grace. It goes without saying that her father, the Jarl, was very overprotective of his daughter. Jarl Herod had given Thora a small snake when she was younger, and Thora placed the snake in a little box with a piece of gold under it. Over the years, the snake grew to immense proportions, but so too did the gold grow, almost as if by magic. Thora lived in a bower, and around the bower the great snake lived, making trouble for all except those that fed it. Eventually, even Jarl Herod became wary of the great snake and the woes that came with it, and he swore an oath. Whichever man could slay the giant snake and rid them of its burden would be allowed to marry his daughter, and all the gold under the snake would be her dowry. Ragnar had heard of the Jarl's oath, but kept it to himself and pretended that he paid no mind to the matter. But, being keen as he was, Ragnar had special clothes made for himself, a pair of trousers, or breeches as they were often called, and a cape. Both were shaggy and hairy in appearance. Ragnar then had his new clothes boiled in tar, and when this was done, he hid the clothes. Not long during the summer, Ragnar led his warriors to the region of Gautland, not far from where Jarl Herod reigned. The next morning, Ragnar woke early and left his men and ship and traveled to the Jarl Herod's gate. To his surprise, not even the Jarl's men were awake yet, so Ragnar decided to head on towards the Bowery where Thora was known to dwell. Before arriving at the Bowery, Ragnar made sure he was armed with the spear he had taken before leaving his men on the shore, and Ragnar had rolled his spear in the sand before he left. Ragnar was prepared, armed, and ready to be done with the snake and claim his prize. Ragnar arrived at the Bowery and wasted no time in finding the head of the snake and stabbed it there with his spear. The second time Ragnar took his aim, he speared the giant snake through the spine and twisted so hard the spearhead broke from the shaft. The giant serpent made so much commotion that the bower shook. As Ragnar turned away from the snake for only a moment, he felt a gush hit him on the back near his shoulders. Thankfully, the shaggy, special clothes he had made and prepared protected him, and he was not harmed by the blood of the snake, which may have been poisonous. Everyone in the bower woke with a start, including the fair Thora. When she saw the large, handsome warrior who had killed the snake, she called out and asked who he was and why he had come to her home. Ragnar stopped walking and replied in poetic verses. Ragnar stated that he had gambled his life for Thora, had battled the giant snake even though he was only 15 years old at the time, and that he had killed the snake even though he knew it would kill him with one bite. And after reciting his prose to Thora, he walked away. Thora understood now why Ragnar was there, and why he had done what he had done. She was taken aback by his size, as he surely did not look 15. And pondering this, Thora walked back to her chambers and went back to sleep. When everyone else woke and roused themselves for the day, they saw that the giant snake had been killed and was amazed. Jarl Herod even had the spear point removed from the snake's body, but even that was so large many had trouble holding it. The Jarl was fairly amused by this, and wondered if it had been a man or beast that had truly rid them of that dreadful snake. The Jarl and his daughter discussed how they could discover who had killed the awful serpent, and how to find who or what had killed it. Thora suggested to her father that he required an assembly, as that would mean everyone would be required to appear, and that whoever held the other end of the spear would be the one who had done the deed. So, as his daughter suggested, Jarl Herod summoned everyone to appear before him. Ragnar and his men, of course, had been told of the summoning, and they attended as asked. Once everyone was present, and it was a very large crowd, Jarl Herod called for a hearing. He thanked everyone in attendance for coming, and then he explained why he had called them all to him. The Jarl went on to tell the crowd that he wanted to acknowledge the killer of the snake, and to make good on his oath. Jarl Herod then asked for the man who held the other end of the spear to come forward. Many men held broken spear shafts, and all who had brought one with them took turns laying them alongside the spearhead to see if they matched up. This went on for some time, until it was brought where Ragnar and his men were seated. Ragnar aligned his spear shaft to the spearhead, and it was apparent to all that he had been the hero to kill the giant snake. Everyone rejoiced, and it would not be long until Ragnar became the most famous man in all the North. Ragnar asked the Jarl for his prize, and the Jarl, so impressed by Ragnar, agreed to arrange for the marriage of his beloved daughter Thora to him, as well as the gold as was promised. Ragnar and Thora were wed, and there were huge feasts and celebrations to honor the occasion. When the wedding festivities were over, Ragnar left for his home and took his new bride, Thora, with him. The two were very much in love, and they eventually had 2 sons. Ragnar and Thora named their sons Eric and Agnar, and the 2 boys grew to take after their father, being exceptionally large, strong, and skilled. Thora fell ill sometime after that, and died because of her sickness. Ragnar was broken-hearted at the loss of his beloved, and soon took to raiding again to help occupy himself and ease his love that was lost. Ragnar and Aslaug. Before we tell the tale of Ragnar and his wife, Aslaug, it is imperative to the story of how Aslaug came to be in the location she was when she first met Ragnar. King Heimer heard of the death of Brynhild and Sigurd, whom he was close with. Upset and worried about their daughter Aslaug, as the king was her foster father, which may have been similar to today's modern concept of godparents, he decided to act. The king was concerned that because of her noble status, Aslaug would be kidnapped or murdered. So King Heimer had a large harp constructed, and inside of it he placed Aslaug, hiding her to keep her safe. The king then filled the hollowed-out harp with rich clothing and silks, valuable jewels, and as much gold as he could fit inside as well, surrounding Aslaug with the finery. During the trek to safety, King Heimer made stops along the way, allowing for Aslaug to stretch and relax. and it is said that he fed her special or even magical herbs that not only helped keep her well fed and satiated, but also helped her grow and become stronger. The king finally came to the farm homestead of Grima and Aki, an elderly couple, at Lindesnes in Norway. Aki was a kind old man, and not knowing who King Heimer was, he asked his identity. The king played the part of a peasant beggar. Aki's wife, Grima, was not as kind as her husband, and she was also observant. Grima saw the fine clothes poking out of the harp here and there, and she also noticed an exquisite, albeit expensive, ring peeking out from the beggar's robes, and determined that the poor man at their doorstep was actually a man of excessive wealth. Wanting the costly items she noted for herself, Grima told her husband that they ought to kill the beggar. Aki did not agree with Grima, and initially refused to follow through with her wishes, but after much aggravation and negotiating, Aki finally caved, and they killed King Heimer in his sleep. It is told that Heimer's outcries just as he was murdered were so loud that the earth shook and the pillars of the house fell. After killing Heimer, the couple broke open the harp, and it was then they discovered Aslaug, who was still just a girl at the time. Aki and Grima decided to raise the girl, Aslaug, as their own daughter, and to hide her identity and beauty. They disguised the girl and renamed her Kraka, which meant crow. Time went on, and Aslaug grew more beautiful, and so she was made to wear a hooded cape and was covered in tar and dirt. And so time went by until one eventful summer when Ragnar and his men came to the region where the homestead was located. Meanwhile, during another summer season of adventure, Ragnar set his ship and men towards Norway so that he could see his friends and kinsmen who lived in the region. One evening he directed his ship to a small harbor to anchor down for the night. A few of his men noticed a small farm not far from shore and decided to go to land to bake bread. Ragnar's men went to the little farm they had noticed in hopes that someone would let them use their home to cook rather than on the shore. Upon arriving at the farm, Ragnar's men met a small old woman and asked if she lived there. The old woman confirmed that she was the lady of the dwelling and told them her name was Grima. Aki had since died, and it was Grima who now controlled the farm. The men explained to Grima that they were men of Ragnar's, and that they needed to bake bread for the rest of the men at their encampment near the shore, and asked Grima if she wouldn't mind helping them complete this task. Grima explained to them that while she was old and her hands were frail, she had a daughter that would be able to help them. Grima went on to tell the men that her daughter's name was Aslaug, and she was wily and hard to control. Aslaug had been tending the livestock and had seen Ragnar and his men when they arrived in the harbor. Aslaug's adoptive mother was woeful of how beautiful her daughter was and would not let her bathe or care for herself regularly. She also always had the nagging fear of others finding out Aslaug's true identity and, in turn, what she and her deceased husband had done out of greed so many years ago. Willful as she was, when Aslaug saw the Viking ship, she set about the task of washing herself, including her stunning hair, which was so long and luxurious, it was said to touch the ground when she unbound it. After cleaning and making herself presentable, Aslaug made her way back home. Upon arriving at her farm, Ragnar's men were taken aback by the sight of Aslaug, trying to compare the ethereal beauty to the old crone of a mother. Grima, who was none too pleased considering the circumstances and Aslaug's disobedience, confirmed that this was her daughter. Aslaug asked Ragnar's men what help they needed from her, and quickly set about kneading the dough for their bread as they suggested. The men were so distracted by Aslaug and her looks, they even burnt the bread they had been preparing for Ragnar and the other men. Ragnar's men finally finished their cooking and went back to the ship and camp to serve the food they had made for them all. The men could not stop talking about Aslaug and how angelic she looked, so much so that even though they may be rightfully punished for serving such unappealing food, they begged to be spared punishment, claiming it was not their fault that they were unable to perform their duties up to the required standard. They repeatedly exclaimed it wasn't their fault. They were so distracted by the lady's beauty that she had bewitched them unawares. Ragnar heard the men and thought to himself that there was no way a woman could ever compare to his dead wife's beauty, and told the men so. The men said that they understood Ragnar's sentiment, but that the lady at the farm was still as beautiful as they claimed. Ragnar told the cooks that he would make them a deal. He would send other men, who he trusted more, to see the lady for themselves the next day. If she was as lovely as they swore she was, he would hold his punishment and forgive their error. But if the lady was not as beautiful as they stated, they would be punished. The cooks readily agreed with Ragnar's deal. The next day there was a strong wind, and Ragnar was not able to send his trusted men to the farm to gaze at the lady the cooks swore resided there. Ragnar told his men that night that he would send them tomorrow. If the lady were in fact as stunning as the cooks claimed, they should ask her to come down to the shoreline and meet him. But Ragnar was a smart man, and he knew that beauty without brains was a waste. So he gave the men special instructions on how this beauty should come and meet him. Ragnar decreed that the maiden comes to him clothed, but unclothed, neither full nor hungry, and that she should not come alone, but not without a companion. The men were puzzled by Ragnar's riddle, but still they traveled to the farm the following day and gave Ragnar's exact instructions to Aslaug. Aslaug thought long and hard about the requirements set upon her. Even though Grima discouraged her from even trying to bother with the conflicting demands, Aslaug needed time to think, so she told Ragnar's men that she would not come today, but would arrive tomorrow. All that evening and into the morning, Aslaug thought. Aslaug met with Ragnar's men and told them that she was almost ready to meet with him, but that she needed to change her clothing and prepare herself. Aslaug used a fishing net as a skirt, used her hair to cover her breasts, and finally felt that she was sufficiently clothed but unclothed. Then Aslaug sat down and took a bite of a leek. She was now neither hungry nor full. When Aslaug decided to leave to meet with Ragnar, she had her dog accompany her down to where he was. This way, she was neither alone or with anyone else. Grima realized that her daughter was much cannier than she realized and was proud of her. When Ragnar saw that Aslaug was heading down towards him, he called out to her, asking who she was there for. Aslaug replied to Ragnar in the form of a small verse, explaining that she was presenting herself to him exactly as he had required. Ragnar had his men go down and meet Aslaug and help her onto his ship, and her dog followed her. When Aslaug approached Ragnar, he reached out a hand in greeting, and suddenly her dog bit his hand. Ragnar's men killed the dog in haste, but other than that, all was well. Ragnar and Aslaug spoke, and Ragnar realized that he was besotted, as Aslaug was as smart as she was beautiful. Ragnar pleaded with Aslaug to join him on his journey, but to no avail. Aslaug replied to Ragnar that she would see him when he returned, and that he may find someone more appealing to him during his voyage. Ragnar then changed his approach and tried to convince Aslaug to at least spend the night with him before they set sail, and she again declined his advances, telling him that he would have to wait until he returned from his voyage. So Ragnar and his men set off, and eventually arrived in Sweden, where he went to visit Eystein Belli, who was a viceroy. While visiting Eystein, Ragnar was implored to marry his daughter, Ingeborg, instead of this Auslaug Ragnar kept speaking of. Eystein told Ragnar that this would be a better marriage, and after much prodding and convincing, Ragnar finally agreed to marry the viceroy's daughter instead. After the interesting visit, Ragnar and his men set out to return to their home. While sailing across the seas, Ragnar and his men spoke of the dilemma and Ragnar's change of heart. 3 birds overheard the gossip and flew to Auslaug and told her of Ragnar's decision. Auslaug, waiting, upset, but determined, and eventually she saw the ship and Ragnar and his men approach. Auslaug met with Ragnar and admonished him for his poor choice. While a marriage to a viceroy's daughter may have been socially more aligned with Ragnar's status, Auslaug admitted to Ragnar that she had actually been adopted by Grima, and that the elderly couple had killed her ward when she was just a girl. She was, actually, after all, the true daughter of the famed Sigurd, who had killed the dragon Fafnir. Auslaug wanted Ragnar to choose her as his wife for who she was, not who she was born of. So Ragnar stole Auslaug away, but before she escaped, Grima put a curse on Auslaug that she said would set in if she did not wait 3 days before consummating her marriage with Ragnar. Unfortunately, after the wedding feast, Ragnar would hear none of Auslaug's warnings about Grima's curse in regards to their consummation, and insisted the wedding be confirmed with union right away, and he would not be dissuaded. When one of their children were born, he was born with no bones in his legs, and he was named Ivar the Boneless for his deformity, just as Grima had cursed. Time passed, and Ragnar set out on another one of his famous voyages, and found himself in the kingdom of King Eystein. King Eystein had a daughter named Ingebjorg, and Ragnar became entranced despite his wife and son at home. The king, being friendly with Ragnar, promised him his daughter, and so Ragnar returned home to Auslaug to tell her that he was going to take another wife. Auslaug, discovering she was with child while Ragnar was away, foretold to Ragnar that she would bear a child who had the image of a serpent in his eye, and if she did have their child, and their child did, in fact, bear the mark she foretold, he should stay with her and her children. If the child did not bear the mark of the snake, he was free to leave and be with Ingebjorg, and she would not attest. Ragnar agreed with Auslaug, and he waited for their child to be born. And, as it was, Auslaug bore a child with the snake in his eye, and he was named Sigurd Snake in the Eye. Ragnar, honoring his word, stayed with Auslaug and did not take Ingebjorg as a wife. Time passed, and King Eystein Belli was made aware that Ragnar had had another child with his wife Auslaug, and that he was staying with her, and refused to marry his daughter Ingebjorn. King Eystein became furious and attempted to rebel against Ragnar and his rule out of fury. At Auslaug's suggestion, Ragnar's older sons went to Sweden and killed the viceroy for his rebellion. As it is told that when Ragnar set out towards England on the expedition that would be his final voyage, he met his end because he failed to listen to Auslaug, who warned Ragnar that this voyage showed bad omens. Auslaug had pleaded with Ragnar, citing that his men were not well enough for the battle that they were about to take on. His wife also pointed out that the ships they were taking were neither the right ships for the journey to England's rough shores, but they were not in the best shape either. Ragnar did not heed his wife's warnings, despite all logic pointing to Aslaug's foretellings being accurate, and set sail with ill and too few men, on ships not adequate for the journey, and left for England anyway. Because of his marriage to Aslaug, and the seemingly magic she possessed, it is said that when King Aela ordered Ragnar thrown into the snake pit that would result in his death, he was protected from the poisonous bites of the snake until the enchanted clothes given to him by Aslaug were ripped from him. Chapter 3. The Death of Ragnar's Sons. The saga told in regards to the death of two of Ragnar's sons is an important one, as it can also be seen as a saga that begins a series of events. When considering the cause and effect of these subsequent events told throughout Norse culture, one can easily ascertain how the death of Ragnar's two older sons eventually led to Ragnar's own subsequent demise and the rise of Ragnar's sons to power. While ancient documents may or may not be historically accurate, they are widely told and accepted as part of Norse culture. This chapter tells the tale, and it goes as follows. When Ragnar's older sons became adults, they sought their own glory. Ragnar's eldest sons wanted to be as legendary and successful as their father, so they set about to make a name for themselves by raiding and conquering. After summer seasons of gaining their own notoriety, the brothers asked Ragnar to provide them with ships and men to conquer even greater enemies. Ragnar's sons then also asked for their father's counsel and wanted Ragnar to tell them where they could find the most difficult foes. Ragnar told his sons of a land where the pagan tribes used magic to overcome their attackers, and to the two brothers, this prospect sounded like a sure way to supersede even their father's fame. Ivar the Boneless, being the eldest of Ragnar's sons, was the leader of the three, so Ivar informed his brothers that these foes had hidden cattle that were so fearsome in appearance that their enemies all ran at the sight of them and were overrun. In order to defeat these people, the brothers only had to stand their ground and not run in fear. So Eric and Agnar left their home and set out to defeat these pagans who used magic. After this defeat, Eric and Agnar, wanting to eclipse their father's legacy, continued to raid and plunder many regions, including those belonging to their father, and took lands that belonged to him, to Ragnar's disapproval. Ivar chose to establish himself in the town of Lidra. The other two sons went about subjugating the lands of Zealand, an island in Denmark, Gotland, Åland, Riedgotteland, and smaller isles all along the coast. To prevent his sons from overshadowing him in legend and power, Ragnar decided to appoint Eystein Belli as the king over the upper lands of Sweden in an attempt to prevent his older sons from trying to implant themselves there and to maintain his control of the region by proxy. Ragnar was upset that his sons would defy him and attempted to outshine him, but he continued his own voyages and raids nevertheless. During one summer, when Ragnar was off raiding in the Baltics, Eric and Agnar arrived at the Lake Malar region in Sweden and sent a message to Eystein Belli. Ragnar's two sons demanded that King Belli meet with them, and during this meeting, Agnar and Eric expressed to King Belli that they required Belli bow down to them, as well as offer up his daughter, Borghild, as a wife for Eric. King Belli asked Eric and Agnar to let him speak with the other Swedish chieftains, and Ragnar's sons allowed for him to do so. King Belli spoke with the other chieftains, and they unanimously agreed to not give in to Ragnar's sons or their demands, but rather decided to defend the region in Ragnar's name, and so they prepared and went to war with Eric and Agnar. King Beli and the other chiefs of Sweden raised a large army between themselves, and they quickly overwhelmed Eric and Agnar's men. During the battle, Agnar was killed and Eric was subsequently captured. Now, King Beli did not wish to harm Ragnar's son, Eric, as Agnar was already killed in battle, and so he attempted to ply Eric with offerings of peace. King Beli offered Eric his daughter, as that was one of the conditions first requested of him, as well as most of the wealth in the region of Uppsala. Eric, being true to himself, denied all of King Beli's offerings. Eric requested that rather than take a peace offering, he would rather be able to pick the day of his death, and King Beli at last settled on this, as he had done all he could to make peace with Ragnar's son. Word eventually traveled to Aslaug about Eric and Agnar, and she became enraged and full of vengeance. Aslaug, calling herself Randalin, raised 1,500 Viking warriors and rode to Eystein Beli, while Ragnar's surviving sons sailed the region on ships. After a long onslaught of battle, Eystein Beli was finally killed, and Agnar and Eric's deaths were finally felt to be avenged. Ragnar was upset that his sons chose to seek revenge without his help and without consulting with him, and he was thinking of his image as well. To ensure he would remain the most legendary Viking in history, he decided to attempt to conquer England with only Norse, to prove himself the most successful and fierce of them all. Aslaug pleaded with Ragnar not to make such an error, and despite her repeated warnings, Ragnar took the 2 ships when they were done being built, sailed to the coast of England, and began his perilous quest for glory. Nars were usually considered merchant ships, and not fit for the rocky shores of England. When Ragnar and his men arrived along the shores of England with his 500 men, the 2 ships were ruined. Ragnar and his men made it safely to shore somehow and began to raid England with fervor. Chapter 4. Raiding along the Isles. Many historians, who believe that Ragnar Lothbrok was an actual Viking who raided and plundered during the Viking Age, believe that it was this king and warrior of large aspirations that may have attacked and raided Ireland in the early years of this exciting era. Both ancient Norse works and scholarly historical chronicles describe Viking raids that befell in Ireland from 832 to 845. The Saxo Grammaticus ascertain that it was Ragnar Lothbrok himself who planned, directed, and controlled the invasions of Ireland during this period. Some ancient recounts credit a man known as Turgesius as the mastermind of the raids in 837. It is interesting that some scholars believe that this Turgesius may have been known by another title. Many allege that he was the heir and child of Harald Harfagri, who was the first king of Norway, although many disagree that the timeline does not add up. This conflict is where many historians claim that the Turgesius that was thought to have initiated the Viking incursion to Ireland was, in fact, Ragnar. After the initial assaults on Ireland, this Viking warlord, perhaps Ragnar, began to establish settlements in the region and colonize the territory. This man was described as reigning over Dublin. After initial colonization had taken place, it is said that one of the Viking rulers was killed, and after that, the Vikings retreated from Dublin, leaving behind those Vikings who had established themselves there. Vikings returned to Dublin in 841, possibly commanded by Ragnar again, and again attacked the region, regaining their control. The raiding and plundering of many regions continued until around 845. In 847, the Irish finally banded together to defeat the Viking invasions, and for a time there was peace. Until, that is, the return of Ragnar's sons between 856 and 857. Whether we will ever know for fact whether Turgesius and Ragnar are one and the same is highly unlikely, as these were ancient times, and formal recording was sparse at best. Many historians have weighed in, and their assumptions that Ragnar was the spearhead of this assault on the British Isles is based on skaldic poems and some ancient Irish and British documents that refer to the ruler of the assaulting Vikings of the period as Ragnar or Ragnall, along with a few other similar variations of the name. It is clear in discovered Norse literature that the leader of the conquering attacks in the British Isles during this period was led by Ragnar. Chapter 5: Death and Vengeance. This chapter reviews the circumstances of Ragnar's death. As it has been previously mentioned, there are two accounts of Ragnar's death. One, heroic and legendary in its own telling, and another just as likely, albeit less Viking-like. It is noteworthy that British historical documents confirm that England was in fact subjugated by the sons of a Viking named Ragnar. At any rate, the retelling of the account below is ascribed to one of the oldest recollections and is included within the sagas of ancient Viking culture. During the time ascribed to this tale, King Aelle ruled over Northumbria in England. When King Aelle learned that the Viking raiders had come into his realm, he mustered a mighty army and marched these warriors against Ragnar. Because Ragnar had only come over with about 500 warriors of his own, Ragnar and his men were overwhelmed by the English forces. There was a ferocious battle between Ragnar and King Aelle's forces. Unfortunately for Ragnar, because the sheer size of the English forces, most of his men were brought low and killed during the battles. Ragnar tried his best and was charged by King Aelle's forces 4 times before being subdued. It is said that Ragnar wore the same silk jacket that Aslaug had given him before he departed from Denmark, and that it was because of the enchantments placed on the garment that iron would not pierce Ragnar. Eventually, though, Ragnar, although unharmed, was taken captive by the English. As punishment for his deeds, King Aelle sentenced Ragnar to death and ordered him thrown into a pit of vipers and snakes. Because of Aslaug's magical jacket, the snakes would hiss and nip toward Ragnar, but did not bite into him or release their poison. King Aelle realized that as long as Ragnar wore the enchanted clothing, he would never be killed by the snakes, and so ordered Ragnar be stripped of his clothes. As soon as his clothes were removed, the snakes attacked Ragnar, thrashing and biting him until he was dead. He died with courage and honor, according to the Viking way, and was welcomed to Valhalla for dying with bravery. Ancient Norse documents contain the purported death poem that Ragnar spoke before he fell into his final sleep. It is claimed that Ragnar wrote the poem himself, memorized, and then recited it just before he died. One monk has recorded what he believed to be the religious enlightenment as to the mythological nature of Ragnar's demise. The monk stated that God had struck Ragnar down for his crimes against Christian nations. When Ragnar's sons heard of their father's death, they rode west to England to take up arms against King Aelle. Ivar the Boneless, Ragnar's eldest son, refused to engage in this endeavor along with his brothers. Because of this, and because King Aelle's army was so immense, the rest of Ragnar's sons and their men were defeated and fled to their ships in retreat. Once the Vikings reached their ships, they retreated back to Denmark. Ivar the Boneless decided to stay in England and set about to entreat with King Aelle in regards to the death of his father and to seek compensation for the killing. Because Ivar held his forces when his brothers attacked in retaliation for the death of Ragnar, and because Ivar requested to meet in civility, King Aelle saw this as a sincere offer of peace. During his communication with King Aelle, Ivar asked the king to compensate him for his father's death by bequeathing as much land as he could to him, as he could not return to Denmark and his brothers empty-handed, and expect them to want peace as well. After considering all that Ivar said, King Aelle agreed to the terms, and the two set negotiations and agreed to terms of land. Ivar stayed in England, and over the course of some time built the town of York. Ivar was canny like his father, and he began to make alliances with the people of the country and surrounding areas. Ivar made a special point to meet and engage with the leaders of the areas as well, and eventually the chiefs of these English lands pled their loyalty to Ivar and his brothers. All the pieces were now in place, and Ivar was ready to make his move. Ivar contacted Ragnar's other sons, his brothers, in Denmark, and informed them that they may be successful in avenging their father's death at the hands of King Aelle if they came to England now, with as large a Viking army as they could muster. When Ivar's brothers received the message, they raised their armies and headed towards England. When Ivar received word his brothers were on their way, Ivar met with King Aelle. Ivar told the king that he wanted to keep him informed, and that he would meet with his brothers when they arrived, in an effort to keep the peace between them and the king. He expressed to the king that he himself could not raise arms against his own brothers, but he would do his best to make their visit to England a peaceable one. The king, unknowing Ivar's true role in the situation, agreed with Ivar and allowed him to be the go-between between himself and Ragnar's other sons. Ivar met with his brothers when they arrived with their army in England, and incited rage and savagery in them in regards to the murder of their father. Once he had successfully ensured the Vikings were thoroughly infuriated and ready to battle, he returned to King Aelle to report to him. Ivar informed King Aelle that his brothers and their army are crazed with revenge, and that they wanted to wage war against King Aelle, no matter the cost. King Aelle was still unaware at this point that Ivar the Boneless had dual intentions, and so he sends his men to meet the Vikings and wage war with them. During the clash of Vikings and English warriors, many of King Aelle's army left his side and joined the Viking cause, thanks to Ivar's years in England and his specific tactical maneuvering of befriending the countryside chieftains close to York. King Aelle and his army soon found themselves outnumbered, and much of his forces were killed in battle. The king, outnumbered and defeated, soon found himself being taken captive by Ragnar's sons. Ivar and his brothers now had the king who killed their father, and they contemplated how their father was tortured at the hands of King Aelle. Ragnar's sons had an eagle cut into the flesh of King Aelle's back, and then ordered all his ribs be cut from his spine with a sword. Once that was finished, the king's lungs were then pulled through the opening and splayed about his body. This form of torture is commonly referred to as the blood eagle method of torture. The blood eagle is always depicted as being performed on royals or people of royal lineage, and is thought to be a blood sacrifice to Odin. After the battle was over and King Aelle was killed, Ivar the Boneless named himself king over the parts of England his forefathers before him held rule over. Ivar had 2 brothers in England, born of Ragnar out of wedlock. Ivar sent the 2 bastard brothers, whose names were Husto and Yngvar, to torture and kill King Edmund the Saint, and once he was dead, Ivar took his kingdom as well. Ragnar Lothbrok's sons became even more ruthless and legendary than their father. They raided more lands in England, Normandy, France, and elsewhere. It is said that the furthest they got in their raiding was the town of Luni. The brothers debated going to Rome, but they decided against it. Ragnar's sons and their battles and raids became infamous and legendary, their exploits famous throughout all the north where Old Norse was spoken. When Ragnar's sons made their way back to their home in Denmark, they divided and shared the lands between themselves and were highly revered. Bjorn Ironside reigned over Uppsala and central Sweden, and it is said that Sigurd, Snake in the Eye, ruled over Holland, Scania, and Zealand, and Oslo and Agdar held power in Norway's uplands, while Hvitserk reigned in Winland and Rydgotaland. Sigurd Snake in the Eye married the daughter of the murdered King Ela, and her name was Belaya. Belaya and Sigurd had one son, named him Horda Knut. The son of Sigurd and Belaya was believed to be named after his godfather, the son of Knut, the foundling. Horda Knut was said to become a powerful ruler as his father and grandfather before him. Knut went on to govern all the lands of Ragnar's sons whenever they went away to battle or raid. It is important to note here again that Ragnar commissioned the building of only 2 ships for his planned invasion to England. These ships were bulky and similar to mercantile ships, as opposed to the sleek and more enduring longboats the Vikings often sailed great distances in. If he had heeded Aslaug's warnings, he may have been alive long enough to have his life and adventures documented better to ensure his legacy lived on. Chapter 6. The Legacy Lives On. Ragnar's Legacy. As you can see, the myth that is Ragnar is a complex tale of a complex man. His contribution to history, whether specifically historically accurate or embedded with myth, cannot be denied. Ragnar's imprint on Norse society was a long-standing one, not flighty or short as many are during ancient times. Ragnar proved that if you are fierce enough, courageous enough, and have big enough aspirations, you can, in fact, leave a legacy that is not only in epic proportions, it can, in fact, make a mark on history itself. Ragnar had a vision, and his vision left a lasting impression on Norse warriors and the way they viewed and engaged in battle. He also changed the culture of his people in the way they marked their seasons. His aspirations of greatness led to his tradition of choosing the summer months as raiding seasons, and this practice continued long after his demise. Discovering and learning to utilize weaponry and technological advances of the countries he raided and invaded, Ragnar ensured that the heathen army would continue to learn from their nemesis and progress with the times. Ragnar also changed and altered the raiding patterns of the Vikings, and this too lived on long after his passing. One cannot help but ponder on whether Ragnar Lothbrok was a hero or a villain. When considering Norse cultural standards and traditional pagan or pre-Christian Scandinavia beliefs, Ragnar did not die an honorable death that would have earned him a place in Valhalla. But again, according to the same religious belief systems that were part of the Viking Age, Ragnar lived and died just as the fates predetermined him to do. He was a man of bravery and courage in the face of many daunting obstacles and foes, but he also was a man of vanity that may have ultimately died simply because he wanted his legacy to outshine those of his sons and did not heed his wife's advice. If we consider the deeds that were committed against people whose regions Ragnar was invading, he can easily be seen as a villain. Raiding involved killing, torture, and destruction of lives, and desecration of holy places, and enslaving and capturing prisoners. When considering that the majority of these invasions may have taken place because the Vikings needed goods and trades in order to live, and many regions would not willingly trade with them, shows us that while the methods may have been cruel, Ragnar did have the people of his homeland in mind. So, Does that make him a hero as well? Ragnar may have been a murderer, but he was also seen as a savior by many of his people during the Viking Age. The trade that eventually evolved into an international trade route, the establishment of settlements in the British Isles that brought about the formation of formal villages and towns where none had existed before, and the advancement of technology and the art of war can all be attributed to Ragnar and his deeds. So, it may be true that everything is equal, so with the bad also comes an equal and fair amount of good. Being born of greatness, Ragnar's sons also continued their father's legacy. During this ancient era, each of Ragnar's sons ruled and rose to greatness in their own rights, and globally held rule over regions throughout the world. That fact, in and of itself, speaks to the lasting legacy that is Ragnar Lothbrok. The Norse lasting impression on modern culture. Even though the Viking Age concluded over 900 years ago, the traditions of the Norsemen and their culture still lives on today. Democratic processes and rules of law are two ideas which were apparent in the Viking era. The Norse practice of Althing is commonly believed to be the first national assembly process to ever occur in European countries. The Althing had the same powers and inner workings of a modern parliament, and the making of laws was a common practice. The Althing also was an assembly that resembled a modern-day court system, which the power to rule and pass judgment on any number of issues, finding guilt or innocence. All free Norsemen took part in this parliament-style assembly, as the rise of great kings eventually led to the demise of this democratic process. It can easily be seen that these ancient Nordic practices paved the way for a more democratic future. Women were not allowed to vote during the Althing, but other than that aspect, Norse women shared many modern rights not seen in other cultures. Norse women who lived during the Viking era enjoyed a considerable amount of equality. Being allowed to divorce their husbands was one such way that many women worldwide do not share, even today. Viking women also were able to own lands and property themselves, and often ran their farms and homesteads with the same capacity as their spouses when they were away raiding or on other journeys. The Viking Age also paved the way to our language today. While Latin and French are often easily identifiable, the fact that much of the root of our words are quite full of and embedded with Old Norse is often overlooked. The Vikings were also a people of abounding creativity, which is apparent in their oral history and the manner in which it presents itself. They were skilled weavers and made their own cloth for every purpose imaginable. They carved on almost every substance, from stone to metal. They painted, they danced, they sang and wrote poetry. And their imaginative, storytelling capabilities have literally stood the test of time. How ironic that a people often seen as rough and savage have some of the longest-held prose of poetry and song. Ireland and Scotland had no established towns or settlements prior to the Viking Age and the subsequent Scandinavian invasion. Towns, villages, and trade centers all evolved into what is now a modern-day, populated region as a direct result of the Viking colonization. If not for the settlements and process of trade commerce, the concept of an international trade economy may not have been realized for centuries to come. A final thing to consider is that had it not been for the Vikings and their inundating raids, the idea of taxes may never have been considered. When the Vikings landed in Europe and began their raids and attacks, European royalties saw that they had to find ways to organize and refuse their advances. Kings were required to raise money and fast, especially once they had gained all they could via the church. The Vikings continued to raid, and especially began to target the churches of Europe, as that was where a majority of the wealth was known to be had. As the threat of Vikings rose, the churches became disadvantaged financially and unable to further assist the ruling class. During one raid in 994, the Norsemen threatened to lay waste to Canterbury Cathedral by way of fire, unless the archbishop agreed to pay them an astronomical sum of money considering the time period. The Archbishop of Canterbury had previously controlled most of the wealth in England, but had to actually borrow money from another bishop to appease the Vikings. After that time, kings began to tax the people they ruled over to compensate their losses and to help continue the financial support needed to reign their lands successfully and protect from catastrophic invasions. Chapter 7. Sources of Information. Literary sources offer the most information available today on Ragnar Lothbrok. While historical references are mentioned, the factual documentation of raids, voyages, conquests, and overall bookkeeping and scribing was not a practice the Norse of the Viking Age took part in. The Scandinavian history is rich in folk tales, stories, myths, and legends, and for what this history lacks in documentation, it most certainly makes up for in excitement and intrigue. The oral historians that the Vikings were, their skalds were creative and skilled enough that many of their stories lived on for centuries to come. Scandinavian skalds traveled from tribe to tribe, bringing along with them information, news, and education. These skalds shared freely with the people of the region, and it was their job to not only share information, but to entertain as well. Music and songs were often a part of the stories they told, and were often the main source of entertainment for the Norse, especially during the long, enduring winter months. Most of the recollections of Ragnar Lothbrok were only penned centuries after the Viking Age and were passed down generationally. It is likely that there were variations and alterations over the years, and scribes of the later centuries could only write what they were told. Inconsistencies abound, but many basic tenets of the story of Ragnar himself seem to have remained much the same. The following references all include mentions, stories, and sagas of Ragnar Lothbrok. The tale of Ragnar's sons was likely scribed in a monastery hundreds of years after the events detailed in the work. It was likely written as a yearly chronicle of the known historical events. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok was written during the 13th century and covers the retelling of the major events of Ragnar's life. The Volsung saga is the document where we begin to learn about Ragnar, and includes tales that span a 100-year time span. The Heimskringla saga was written by Snorri around 1230, and while it is an exciting read, many scholars dismiss this body of work as one of fiction over fact. Snorri was a historian and poet. While his saga may not be historically factual in every way, it does deliver much insight into Scandinavian politics and culture. The Prose Edda, also written by Snorri, is the foundation of the sagas of Ragnar Lothbrok and the tale of Ragnar's sons. This body of work gives quite a bit of description on Norse mythology. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was initiated in the 700s and seems to have been penned around the period in which it references. Although Ragnar is not mentioned specifically in this documentation, it does provide an English view into the Viking invasions that occurred during the era. The Krakomal is the story of Ragnar's death and is believed to have been written around 1100. This work includes the poem that Ragnar supposedly composed and spoke before his demise. History of the Danes was written between 1150 and 1220 and was written by a historian of Danish descent. This documentation gives insight to values and mentions Ragnar by name. The Annals of Ireland mentions a son of Ragnar, and many scholars cite this mention as proof that Ragnar was, in fact, a real man and not just a mythological legend. The Poetic Edda is a collection of Norse legends and myths, and is the most popular and widely known body of work that contains poems and sagas of the ancient Norse. Conclusion. The ancient culture and traditions of the North is a fascinating and complex one. It is no wonder that men such as the iconic Ragnar Lothbrok herald from this age of long ago. We thank you for your interest in Ragnar Lothbrok and the man behind the sagas, poems, and stories that have survived centuries. We hope that this book provided you with a look into not only the epic stories and mythological legends that surround the great Viking king of the Norse, but that it also encouraged you to look beyond the myths and into who this man may have truly been at the core. Further investigation into the ancient customs and people like Ragnar will help us learn more about our own traditions and customs today, as it is apparent that many of them originated from this long ago era. Thank you for listening to this book. We do hope it is full of fun and interesting facts and myths for you to consider. Finally, if you found this useful or entertaining in any way, a review is always appreciated. This has been Ragnar Lothbrok, the tale of a Viking warrior king, written by Bernard Hayes, narrated by J. Huff. Copyright 2017 by Bernard Hayes. Production copyright 2017 by Bernard Hayes.